We welcome you to the Gaming Malta European Fantasy Sports Summit, supported by DraftKings.
Good morning.
It's a pleasure to be here in Malta today to speak at the first European Fantasy Sports Summit.
Gaming in all areas is growing. Now we're looking at fantasy sports, which is a new area which we're also sponsoring this year.
Malta is very proud to be the first EU state to have legislated and have come up with this skill games license for fantasy sports.
It's great that the DFS is becoming the topic that everybody discuss, that everybody needs to understand that it's different from other verticals like sportsbook, like poker, and it deserves its own segment, its own event to be discussed, because it's really different. So I absolutely love this event, and I would like to thank the organizers for doing that.
Fantastic. I mean, I heard from a lot of people who were here last year that it's grown a lot, so it's way bigger and more sophisticated than I had expected. So
I see with the DFS as a good opportunity for companies to add a new product to their portfolio and add a bit more for their members or for their players.
It's just to be around, learn the industry that we're in, show ourselves, make new connections. But right now, specifically, we're looking for investors and maybe operators and other partners that are looking to launch a white label or black label solutions with us.
We are now honored and privileged to welcome on stage the Honorable Sylvia Oshkembry.
Sigma event is not only a staple of the local iGaming calendar, but also one of the largest and most successful iGaming events in Europe. With this summit, we are reinforcing our dedication to further support the DFS sector, which I believe has a bright future in Europe, and having Malta as the thought leader while shaping the agenda for this sector.
Kicking off the afternoon is Ivan Folletti from the Gaming Malta Foundation.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. It's fantasy sports, so we're meant to be energized. So we'll try that again. Good afternoon, everybody. All right. I won't be singing, don't worry. Okay, so welcome, honestly, welcome to the European Fantasy Sports Summit. Who am I? What do we do? Who is Gaming Malta? Gaming Malta is a foundation set up by the government and by the Malta Gaming Authority to promote Malta's home of gaming excellence. So that is our North Star. What we also do is, linked up to this, is we promote also other verticals. And fantasy sports is one of the business verticals which Malta as a jurisdiction is promoting. And that's why we are honored to host you here to also host key leadership in the fantasy sports sector. We're also, I'm proud to say also today that we have here a number of students from the European Gaming Institute of Malta. So this is an institute which has been set up by the government and also with MCOST to offer full-time programs, diploma programs in iGaming. Okay, so this is the way that we're going. We feel that having the younger generation and also the young talent emerging is extremely important, both for the sector and also for the jurisdiction. Fantasy sports. We wanted to start off with a review of what happened last year. We know that the sector has its own challenges. It also has, obviously, its own opportunities. Some people you've seen in the video, the businesses are not there anymore, okay? But others have also found new areas of growth. So what we're going to bring together is, today, very clearly the emerging teams in fantasy sports, looking also at the millennial challenges and the millennial dilemma, okay? And ultimately, what will be our springboard to the future. So I hope you'll find this couple of hours this afternoon very insightful, energizing, and I hope you will also enjoy this Thought Leadership Forum today. Thank you very much.
Let's take a deep dive and look at the emerging themes in the DFS world. Hampus Haglov, a veteran of the sector, will set the scene for this.
Hello. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Gaming Malta, for inviting us and organizing this fantastic event. And welcome, students. It's really encouraging to see you guys here. I hope you'll have a lot of fun. So I'm going to frame the agenda of today and have a look at the fantasy games or the manager games, where they started, and then ask at the end some questions which will then be looked deeper into from the other speakers and the conferences. So, how did it all start? Well, the concept, as you may know, is about picking players and running a contest based on how those players actually perform. First game that I have found researching the vast resources of internet is that it was actually a golf game. Now, it doesn't make sense because it's so simple. You just count the scores. I choose 3 players, you choose 3 players, and the eclectic score of those 3 players, the best score wins. Moving on to that, that was in the 50s, by the way. A guy who's generally acknowledged to be the first inventor of the game was Wilfred Winkenbach. He was an owner of a franchise called Oakland Raiders. Some of you may be familiar with that, but one of their great all-time running backs is on a player card there, Marcus Allen. The first league that we know of was called Greater Oakland Professional Pigskin Prognosticators League. For some reason, that name didn't stick. This was very complicated, but it actually touched on one of the best sports adaptable for manager games. Okay, what happened then? Baseball came up, another stats-driven sport. But the serious and very important change here was that you selected your team, and then you could replace players and score it according to what the games resulted in. So it was really, really stats-driven. And again, for me at least interesting, was it was created in this restaurant by a couple of journalists. The restaurant name was La Rotisserie, and they called them Rotisserie League. And for those Americans out there, you may very well recognize that the Roto name is still around. It's called from, it originates from that restaurant. And another thing that's worthwhile mentioning here is that it was journalists that took this on. They loved the sport, so they wanted to play it. And today, journalists also play a very important part in the future of manager games. Okay. So far, we've talked about season-long games. Today, we are mostly, the biggest area of the business is daily fantasy sports. This also has a long history, but we must remember that for it to be viable, we needed the internet. There's no way that you can have an interesting competition over a day when you only get the results 2 days later. So there were some significant attempts in 1990 that people loved. They had lots of players, but no success. No success whatsoever. And then an Irish company, or registered in Ireland, FanDuel registered in 2009, and I suppose they're familiar to all of you. And eventually DraftKings registered in 2012. Now I have conflicting dates from that, but I'm sure Jeffrey can tell us which one is accurate. This name Pigskin Playoff still hung around here in the early 90s and the early 2000s as well. So now that we know that there are companies out there who want to deliver daily fantasy sports, what sports did they deliver? Where did it all start? And of course, American sports are excellent because it's stats, stats, and stats. So ice hockey, American football, baseball, and basketball, they were the first four. In Europe, football had to be managed. We have the Premier League football game, which has 5 million entries last year. Fantastic game. Tennis, MMA, Formula One, NASCAR, cricket, cycling. And we know there are already games, fantasy games for esports, and that will only develop. So started with the American sports, and now we're into the virtual environments. One thing in common, though, that we must remember, all these are skill-based. There's still no random number generator involved anywhere in playing fantasy games. And that's very important. How has this grown? And now we're entering, as Ivan touched upon, something that is both good, fantastic, but it's also, we also haven't met all of the expectations of growth that were prognosticated 3-4 years ago. But we can say for sure that we know that there's almost 60 million players in North America. 60 million players, that's a lot. 5 million players, like I said, play Fantasy Premier League, and that's a scoring system that's well established and known. Indian companies claim to have plus 40 million users, cricket being the main objective there. Some numbers as well, 2017 entry fees in North America, 3.2 billion with a $355 million revenue, more than 10%. Worth mentioning as well, more than 4,200 people are employed in the fantasy business worldwide. That's a company from an Australian, that's a number from an Australian research company called IBIS. All right. Another thing that we need to remember when we talk about the industry is it's not only us delivering a fantasy games. We have other people involved as well. The operators and the people who develop the games, sometimes they're one and the same. But more importantly, this is a way to reach a broader audience with the sports. So the sports federations are actively involved in America, and they're actively involved in Sweden, as I know, and they're actively involved in the UK as well. This promotes their sport in a nice and fair way. Media rights holders, we all know what Sky Sports do with the fantasy sports. You know, they promote the games a lot. Again, those are free games, but still, it's fantasy games. It's fun. It's fair. No RNG. The broadcasters themselves, of course, are interested in high ratings. So the more they can connect a game with their product, the better it is, because they can sell advertising spots. Journalists, as we touched upon, they once came up with the idea for the game. They're also interesting because they say you should pick this player, you should pick that player, or this player is not good because he's actually injured today, or something like that. Who else? Data providers, regulators, service providers. There's a lot of things attached to this industry, which is already established. Some numbers again. The dominant online gambling market is Europe. Numbers from H2 Gambling Capital. Their prognosis is that it will remain like this, even though the US is supposed to take a larger share of the market. So pretty dominant, as you can see, the red slice there for Europe, where we are. And the most popular gambling activities, again, sports betting. And this is something that I want to point out. It actually does read skill games here, but I'm pretty sure that, you know, just considering what I've just been saying, it's sports. It is sports. I'm not saying it's sports betting, but what's the difference between us? There's just the way that we place the bet. There's still no random number generator anywhere. And I think that we should not perhaps include ourselves in the market, but we should be targeting all of these customers are potential customers of fantasy games. Actually, the casino ones as well, because they will come around eventually. Demographics. The Fantasy Trade Organization in the US provide us with a couple of numbers. I looked them up, and those numbers are challenged in other studies. But the average fantasy player, is 32 years old. They're well educated, and they spend above average annually on fantasy sports. However, sports bettors, and one thing, the FTSA study also say that there's a large percentage of women in there. This is definitely contradicted by the group of sports betting, where 88% are still male. So that means that there's a huge target group of women still out there. Sports bettors are divided into two groups, which kind of, you know, makes the average 32 also come into question, because they've realized that in the younger age group, 40% of all players are between 18 and 29, and 34% are over 50. So what do they do between the age of 30 and 49? I don't know, careers and kids maybe? They're betting less. And again, framing a little bit the questions that are going to be discussed here in the upcoming 40 minutes or so is, what mediums do we use to display our games? And I just cut a quote here from Betson that says that 59% of their revenue came from mobile devices, compared to just 7% 5 years ago. 70% of revenue from sports betting comes through the mobile interface. 70%. What does this mean for us as providers? I think it's pretty clear we must be able to deliver the games through the mobile. Okay, so that's about everything that we know so far. I've called this halftime, okay? So I'm just going to summarize a little bit. There's great tradition in the game. We know it's intriguing. We know it's engaging. We've seen our customers, for instance, they come back every single day. It's skills-based. There's no RNG, definitely no RNG. We think and believe that it increases sports consumption. Studies show that it increases sports consumption a lot. This is good for the leagues, for the rights holders, and for the broadcasting networks. There's multiple stakeholders in this industry. It attracts a specific but many demographics. We'll talk more about that later. And we must not separate ourselves from sports betting, I think. That's my personal view, but sports betting is all over the world. It's easy, it's a familiar product. We should embrace it and not separate ourselves from it. And finally, like I said, if it's not mobile, you should probably rethink it. Anyway, okay. Now, this slide will, I'm going to start to discuss a little bit about something called Generation Z, of which we have, hopefully, a fair few representatives right here. Do you know what a Generation Z is? It says right there. Okay. Okay, so the oldest Generation Z today is 23 years old. And the group between 18 and 23 are already more than the millennials. There's more of Generation Z eligible to play than millennials. Millennials, by the way, are those classified as the ones that grew up with the emerging technology that that you guys are taking for granted today. Okay? The mindset of these two groups, the millennials and the Generation Z, are vastly different. I will show you soon. And I'm saying now that one of the discussions that we need to have here today is how do we meet and how do we understand those requirements? Because everyone who is now making the games and promoting the games are in this group or older. Okay. So you won't be able to see this very well, so I'll talk a little bit about the ones that I think is interesting. So it says the difference here. You have, these are the millennials, and these are the Generation Z. Okay, so a millennial multitasks across 2 screens. A Generation Z individual across 5 screens. A millennial communicate with text, SMS, WhatsApp. The Generation Z, they use emojis. They use Snapchat instead of Facebook. This is familiar to you, but it's still interesting because there's a difference. The attention span of a millennial is pretty good, but it's really poor with you guys. You just snack content. This is being picked up by the networks in the US, the sports networks. As of this year, you can subscribe to not viewing the first 3 quarters of a basketball game, just the final 15 minutes. You pay to do this, not to see the whole game. Okay. What else? Millennial is focused on now. The Z generation is focused on the future. It's a me generation, the millennials. It's a we generation, the Z generation. Okay, so there are a lot of differences. I think I'm making my point now that if we want to cater for these younger people, we need to also consider what their requirements are. And they are different, definitely different. This slide, if you would, is also available on the internet. I didn't make it up myself. All right. So what does this mean for us as that work in this industry? Well, we need to design our games a little bit different. We need to enable people to play in briefer stints, shorter periods, faster outcome. And this is already picked up by some sport books that have in-game games that last only 90 seconds. They have proven extremely popular with younger people. And as I said previously, this generation will consume sports differently, which means that they may not find 90 minutes with a halftime 15 minutes wait is really, really that exciting. So I think if you summarize those two, more in play, more betting opportunities. I say bet, but I mean opportunities to have a flutter. And shorter determination of outcome. That's what it's leading to. But there are some very positives about this as well. And that is that the Z generation are very interested in sports. They just consume it differently. It seems like they're actually more interested in sports than the generation before. They are interested in stuff like Activision Blizzard and Electronic Arts, EA. You're familiar with this? This is big with them. They also, I forgot to say something, they are also not deterred by a lot of information on one screen, which is completely different from myself, for instance. Okay, so what next? And these are the questions I hope that we will be able to discuss with the panelists and the speakers. How will fantasy or manager games spread? What mediums? TV? Operators? William Hill, Unibet? Or dedicated sites? DraftKings? FanDuel? Is the product good enough for the future? Is it future-proof? Will you guys play it? Will you like to spend money on it? And what sports is it really? Are we going to make a splash with this format on esports? Or is it the stats-driven combination with Sunday football and Monday night football that is the magic juice? Is there further development in fantasy games? In betting games, more details, player cards, jackpots? I don't know. And then there's something that I haven't really mentioned, but there is a shark issue. And when I talk to operators who were once in on the poker networks, they see this as a bit of a problem. Now, if you have your own standalone network of players, it doesn't mean the money just flows inside your operations. But if you share liquidity across multiple operators, you have the risk of some very specifically skilled players winning a lot of money from other ones, making marketing, well, either ridiculous or very expensive. So those are issues that we will talk about and see if we can address. And that concludes my introduction to it. The next event on the agenda will include some questions, but none now. Thank you very much.
It's all about challenges and opportunities. Jeffrey Haas is our special guest on the hot seat, interviewed by Hampus Hagla.
Sir.
Hi, Jeff.
Hi. Should we take a seat?
Do you want to sit down or stand up? It's like, yeah, you're better standing up, I think.
I suppose.
Yeah, all right. So, would you like to quickly introduce yourself for the people that don't know? Is there a... No.
No, I guess we're not going to use them. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Hawes. I'm the Chief International Officer for DraftKings, which is a US-based daily fantasy sports company that was founded in 2012, as Hampus was saying earlier. And I live in London. We're licensed here in Malta. We have businesses around the world. And I've had the pleasure of knowing Hampus for a few years now.
Thank you. So there's a Q&A session here. We have 15 minutes, and there will be a couple of questions from the audience as well. But Jeffrey, to start off with, can you shed some light on where the fantasy industry is now, and what opportunities and challenges that have arisen in the last year?
Well, I think that you raised some excellent questions in your keynote earlier. The fantasy industry today remains robust. I don't know if anybody here plays Fantasy Premier League. Okay, so about a quarter of the room play that game, which shows that, you know, there is a robust audience, not only in the UK. The stat you showed earlier was 5 million, but they have more than 7.5 million players in Europe who are playing Fantasy Premier League across the Premier League's own product, across Fantasy FC by the Sun newspaper, and there are numerous other products that focus on Premier League fantasy as well. We have Bundesliga, we have Serie A, who have their own products as well. I mean, you're starting to see a lot more growth of fantasy products that are not only from an independent B2C operators around the world, but also the leagues themselves. You know, we work with EuroLeague basketball, but they have had their own fantasy product for quite a few years. We're aware that AFL in Australia has their own product. You know, it is something that is global because it's a fun product to play. You know, if you guys are playing Fantasy Premier League, you're probably watching the matches at home and you're playing against each other to see who does better, you know, every week. But on the daily fantasy products, which we have, it drives daily engagement. And it's a lot more fun to have skin in the game, if you will, because it's an opportunity to show off your own skills and expertise and knowledge about your favorite sports, players, and leagues.
Okay, so opportunities and challenges. I mean, if we start with Europe, perhaps is most relevant.
Sure. I think there's a lot of opportunities here because the product is available in so few markets. And the opportunity and the risk sort of go hand in hand here. The biggest challenge we have had for years, establishing ourselves in Europe and around the world, is the lack of certainty around classification of our product category, corresponding legislation, which then allows it to be offered, and then the regulation, which determines what appropriate consumer safeguards are in place, operational protocols, etc. And that lack of clarity across many regulations provides a lot of friction for new operators to come into the market, for startups to get going, and even for established operators like DraftKings to grow themselves. Examples of that would be Netherlands and Sweden and Spain. I would say every regulated gaming market across Europe is one which a small group of operators have engaged with regulators within as well as legislators to try to help them understand what we are, why we are not necessarily sports betting, it shouldn't be classified as such, and how to best allow us to grow, both from technical and compliance framework perspectives as well as operationally. And that lack of education, even though we've now been investing in that for years, means there are limits to what we can do as far as establishing and growing the businesses.
Just to underline your point here of being separate from sports betting, that is because the business model is so vastly different in the first instance, right?
That's a significant factor of it as far as how revenues are generated through what we're doing is we're facilitating a peer-to-peer game and then taking an administration fee, if you will, for offering that service. And that is not something that's necessarily contemplated in how sports betting revenues are calculated. The other thing is because it's predominantly a game of skill, you know, one would argue it is a game solely of skill. The game integrity requirements for it are vastly different than sports betting. In order for somebody to fix a game, you'd have to engineer the outcome of every single player in an entire match and on both sides, and then every other team that's playing in order to have any type of bias towards the outcome there. And as we go through the education process with regulators and explain these things, sometimes we're able to shape intelligent, well thought out regulation, such as what they have here in Malta, and other times it takes more time to get that desirable result.
Okay. Yeah, we have worked together on those, and with some results, I have to say, much thanks to you guys. So what are the most common misconceptions that you get from politicians or regulators about, well, the entire space, fantasy sports space?
I think generally there's a confusion about what the free-to-play products are versus the pay-to-play products, how exactly they work, how it is that we're able to offer a service globally that shares liquidity from our United States player pool. But that in and of itself provides a more compelling product experience because people are interested in winning larger prizes, of course. The other common misperception we have is, what is the impact we have on sporting organizations, around leagues, around clubs, around players? Are we having a positive or detrimental effect on those sports themselves? And Hampus, in your keynote, you were talking quite a bit about that, about how we drive further player engagement. And the fact is we've done numerous studies on whether people are consuming more sports content as a result of playing on our product. They do watch more TV. The players of our product who are following a sport and competing with their friends or people around the world on our product are watching more matches on TV, reading more newspapers, buying magazines. There are publications solely dedicated to stats on fantasy players in order to help people draft their lineups on a regular basis. So we have a phenomenal impact on media organizations as well as sports bodies and individual leagues and players as a result of offering our products. As well, more specifically, we've been able to watch the impact in certain jurisdictions as a result of launching games for the first time. So the European Tour, when we launched their golf product, when we launched games based on their golf product in America, their TV ratings went through the roof. When we launched Canadian Football League for the first time, as it was broadcast on ESPN2, their TV ratings went up significantly as a result of that. So there's a direct relation, a direct proportional relation between the investment of fantasy games in media and sports organizations to their actual ratings and fan bases.
Okay, so checking on my watch here, I know we've run out of time, but I'll two questions from the audience, if there are any, okay? Let me collect a microphone here. Anyone have a question for Jeffrey? Once in a lifetime opportunity? Thank you, and I'll get to you. Switch on the bottom there.
One. Jeffrey, hello. Thanks for coming in. Tell me, please, in your personal opinion, what is the best marketing strategy of promoting your product on new market? When you're coming, right now you're coming to Europe, but sooner you're gonna come to Latin America, another part of the world. How will you promote your product? This is the question. How can you convince people to play fantasy sports?
It's an excellent question. It's one we struggle with. Not just how to acquire customers, but how to acquire customers cost effectively through efficient channels in order to ensure that the cost to acquire them is less than their lifetime value, so ultimately running a profitable business. I would recommend extensive testing, A/B testing through digital channels. Direct response will typically be the most effective way. I would say that a lot of the sports body relationships with the leagues as well as the clubs ends up being quite expensive to come out of the gate with. So if you're a startup trying to raise awareness, try to find a way to cut through. There are some examples of people who have done that quite effectively in the past in the fantasy sports space through virals. I would say learn from the overall category, not just fantasy operators, but gaming operators. Try to develop relationships, of course, relationships with media organizations, sporting organizations, in order to try to maximize whatever marketing budget you have available.
So cross-marketing is your main point, right? Like making connections with the big guys on the market and getting people involved to fantasy sports through the betting and all kind of media on the market, right?
True. I mean, acquisition marketing is, to some extent, a data science today. And there are a lot of people who are competing for share of voice within that market. inordinately challenging. It's something just to really spend some time wrapping your head around. You should consider whether or not to invest in a brand campaign in order to raise awareness of whatever your consumer proposition is. You also then need to consider how to channel acquisition marketing. Look at affiliates. You should look at direct response through digital. You may want to consider above the line depending on budgets. And then, of course, rely on your existing community. Ideally, you have a product that is so compelling that you encourage your players to use word of mouth to get their friends and family to be playing as well.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Welcome.
Hello, Keith from Fantasy Team. Quick question. With the slow introduction of sports betting in the US, do you see daily fantasy keeping its market over there, and how you see it in the future?
So New Jersey went live with sports betting in August of this year. We don't have that many months of experience in that product category to really go by. I can say that DraftKings is up about 20% year over year. We continue to grow, and we continue to invest in our fantasy product, and our intent is to do so forever. We believe in fantasy as a method of fan engagement, as a compelling game. It's a wonderful experience, and innately it's different than your sports betting proposition. I feel that the two of them together are highly complementary for the purpose of, acquiring customers, cross-selling them, increasing their lifetime values. I know there's a number of daily fantasy sports B2B operators here, Hampus and some others. They're out there very successfully selling their daily fantasy sports products to sportsbook operators in Europe for exactly that reason. Here's an opportunity to deepen the relationship you have with your customer by cross-selling them across not only just a game itself, but across your entire gaming ecosystem. So I believe that as a result of our investment in sports betting, our fantasy sports business will grow, and vice versa.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Jeffrey.
My pleasure.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Being customer-centric is key. Niccolo Carametti makes a case on why DFS players add value to the customer journey of any online gaming vertical.
Thank you very much to invite me here. The Gaming Malta has been extremely nice to give me the chance to explain something that I really want to give out in my experience to such an important audience. So basically, we are a B2B daily fantasy sport company, and the first challenge we met while trying to sell our product to mostly betting companies in Italy is how a daily fantasy sport will not take away money from the existing clients they have. I mean, this was the fear they face, and say, no, you are going to use our client base for a product that doesn't give the same revenues we already have. So this was the first concern that I have to face. And I want to explain why that is, in my opinion, is terribly wrong. Actually, we have an opportunity here. Daily fantasy sport, actually, a daily fantasy sport player is really a gold mine for a betting company, because a daily fantasy sport player leaves an experience with daily fantasy sports throughout a week mostly, even if it's called daily. I mean, that's the point. We have a pre-match period, which goes from the minute that a match is over to the next match. We have the live, which is probably the most engaging time for a daily fantasy sport player. And then we have a post-match, and I will go through that later, which is exactly as important as the first two. As I said, we have a very standard engagement that goes through a long time for a daily fantasy sport player. It's a typical pre-match game. Why? Because the user should study the games. It's a skill game, obviously. So you should study the game. You should start getting to know who is playing, who is going to be banned for that game, who is injured. So you will start from the beginning of the week reading how the previous match has gone, and starting with the forecast who is going to be in the starting lineup for the next game. So you have a whole week mostly if you look at the weekend games, but then if you think about, I'm talking about football obviously, because in Europe we have football as a main game, but you're talking about like European Cups, so you have plenty of time to think about the next game. And that makes the user going to the platform and preparing the lineup days in advance. So what does that mean? It means that you have unsolicited visits to the betting platform from a user that usually you would have only if they go just for that specific bet or just or that specific game. This is really important because you don't need to invest in calling up that player to your platform to make him bet. You already have it with this game. So another thing that is really important, and I will go to that later. When a player is playing daily fantasy sport, and above all, he already set up his lineup, then he's totally passive to the game. But again, he spends a lot of time within the platform, within the platform. So I'll give you an example. I just put my lineup in. The matches are beginning, and I'm there, and I want to check what's going on, what my contest, how my contest is going, and I keep refreshing the app or whatever the website I'm using, and I'm there, I'm passive. I'm doing absolutely nothing. I'm just looking at the stats. That is an amazing opportunity to cross-sell any other games within my platform. I can I can use a push to help him to bet on the game I'm following to the next game. I have the full attention of this player, and that's the only game that allows me to do that. And then I got a post-match analysis. Why? If I bet on a match, I don't need to go back to the betting platform to check the result. I mean, a football game, I can check the scores everywhere. But if I want to know how my fantasy sport contest has ended, did I win, did I lose, I have to go back to the betting platform. I'm there again. And not only in just watching my ranking position, I just want to check how my players ranked, the stats of the single players, why that guy did better than me, what players he picked that I could have picked. That's really important because it makes my experience longer than usual. I just go there and back again. So, as I said before, we have unsolicited visit to the platform, which is extremely important. You have a client that is coming without you pushing it to do that, and there's no other game. Betting is really a spot game. You have that moment, the matches, and the player goes there just to make the single bet. Here he's coming and he's spending time before the beginning of the match. And above all, if you have a contest, let's say I take the example of the Serie A, where you have games that usually should not be in the main focus of a single player. You have like tier 3 Serie A games with players that are ranked in the low position that usually you don't follow at all, but they're part of your daily fantasy sport contest. You're going to check those players playing that game, and you get more knowledgeable about those games. So you're more involved in the whole Serie A or Premier League or whatever teams, and you feel to have the knowledge to bet on those games, while you wouldn't have before. I mean, you can bet just for fun on a game. When you know the players of each single team, you know that the famous striker is not playing, or the less known striker is not playing, you're going to bet on that match because you have a better knowledge. So a skill game like daily fantasy sports reflects on betting. It helps the player to bet more. Obviously, it's probably more knowledgeable, so we give a higher payout. But again, it will spend more on betting. He will never bet on that game otherwise. Okay, we already touched this subject, but I want to underscore that the players stick to the platform. That's the most important thing for daily fantasy sport. Here, I'm not saying how daily fantasy sports are good for revenues. I mean, we give that for granted. I mean, you might have a daily fantasy sport platform that producing revenues, and that will not take money away. And just to other games, obviously. I'm just saying that having a daily fantasy sport platform within your games, within your offer, will help you to sell more of the other games. Another really important thing that I want to touch: how many betting platforms are spending thousands of euros to have live streaming in order to achieve exactly the same goal, to keep the player within the platform? So I offer football games, the football match streaming without commentary, hoping that the player will stay there and bet again. I have a game that is actually making revenues, and it is achieving exactly the same. The player stays within the platform. So why not highlight that to my players? And instead of spending money to hoping that he will watch a tiny little match on a screen without commentary. That is how you want your client to stay within your platform and to stick there and be focused and be also passive to receive push information and bet in some other games. Somebody might argue that poker does the same. I mean, you have a long experience for the player on a poker tournament. Yes, it's true. But first of all, when you play poker, your attention is on a poker table. You're there, and you can't really do something else because we don't want to miss a hand. And on top of that, you have a very cheap experience for the betting company because I play a poker tournament. I pay whatever it is, the buy-in amount, but the rake is that, and it's fixed, and I may play 5 hours of a poker tournament, and I have the client there doing just that. While with daily fantasy sports, as I said before, it can do many other things. So compared to poker, if we look at the cross-selling opportunities, is really much bigger. Again, cross-selling with betting, you have entered a tournament, a contest in daily fantasy sport, and 5 minutes to the end, you have one match missing, and you have a striker from your opponent that is playing the next match. Why not betting that that striker will score? It's actually an edging opportunity. You are going to cover your position. Whatever is going to happen in the next match, you either win from daily fantasy sport or from your bet. So it's really a cross-selling opportunity. The two games create a perfect matchup. As I said in the beginning, while for betting you can check the scores wherever you want, in daily fantasy sports you must go back to your platform. Is there exactly where you will find the final scores. And that's the only game that allows the player to come for no reason whatsoever unless he wants to check the results. And he has to, or otherwise you wouldn't know. This doesn't happen with betting. In poker, the result is exactly the minute that you got knocked out. So this again is an opportunity. Players goes back to the platform. It can be pushed to do something else, another game, another bet, another whatever. So you have huge opportunity for cross-selling again. So in the end, it circle up together. Daily fantasy sport and betting are perfect matchup. Whatever daily fantasy sports cannot do on its own because of some obvious limitation of the game. I mean, it's not a 24/7 type of game. It doesn't cover all the matches. It doesn't cover every single minute of the day. But it takes, again, a huge time of the player, and you can use that to enhance the revenues towards all your games offering on the platform. I'm done with that. Thank you. Is there any question?
set the pace on the emerging themes, highlighted the challenges and opportunities, and focused on being customer-centric. John Gordon, Carl Grech, and Niccolo Carametti will now take the conversation on stage.
Thank you very much. So welcome, John. Welcome, Carl. And thanks, Nicola, for a very interesting presentation. Now, Nicola, in your opinion then, what you're saying basically is that if you offer both of these games, you get more revenue from one single customer than if you don't.
Yeah, actually, that's my opinion. I mean, you push a player to play more, obviously. He has more chances to play more. I mean, if a client enters a shop more times, the odds that he will buy more are greatly increased. Yeah, well, so this is what I think is going to happen on an online gaming platform too.
Okay. Carl, would you?
Yeah, I totally agree. That's exactly what we're trying to tell operators when we speak to them. Most of the operators out there haven't yet introduced DFS. It's not something like sportsbook, casino, and poker, where every website you visit has the product. So I think that's the main conversation we're having with the operators. They tell us, okay, why do I need DFS? And we just tell them, listen, what you want is you want to keep the players on your side for a longer period of time, doing more. So DFS is a good opportunity.
John, would you?
Yes, no, I think we too are a B2B fantasy provider, and we do think it adds another vertical. Okay. We specifically use it as a customer acquisition tool where we upsell to sportsbook and casino. So it certainly complements the sportsbook betting and increasing the lifetime value of the user.
Okay, great. So, John, starting again with you, when I know your games you have a little bit of a different take, which I think you will expand on later, so stay tuned for that.
Yes.
But when you design games, or when you decide on how to design a game, what are you thinking about a little bit?
So we look at it from a different approach in terms of we used to be a weekly, daily fantasy sports betting platform, but we look at it, take it from approach of gamification, which really what fantasy sports is looking at a real live event and turning it into a game. And we are really focusing on the behaviors and how to get your end client, end user to how they consume the sport, and really look at it from a gamification, neuroscience point of view, and trying to tailor it to like that. So when we're creating a game now, it really looks on different aspects of neuroscience rather than just creating a fun-to-play game.
Okay. So then if you design your games differently, do you have a specific customer in mind? Like, is it only gambling operators, or?
Well, so our games are for aggregators, operators, or media companies. But the end user, it's certainly with that in mind as well. Obviously, it's all about casual sports and how easily can they choose a team and how can it be mobile first. You know, as you were saying there, Generation Z, the attention span is so short now that it has to be the most streamlined way of choosing a team. You know, traditional fantasy sports, it may take you a good hour on a desktop to choose the best team if you've got any chance of winning real money. Whereas I think we need to condense that into choosing a team in less than a minute, and that's what we've been focusing on to make sure it's as easy as possible, as digestible as possible for that Generation Z.
Okay, Carl, another question, different question for you then. We talked a little bit about obstacles you mentioned that. What are the objections that you get from operators? I mean,
that's a good question. So obviously the bigger operators make most of their money out of their sportsbook. So they're just afraid to change or disturb the ecosystem. So they tell us that when we go and introduce something where we want to talk to the sportsbook database, they tell us we're okay, we're happy with how the players are behaving, and now we try and change their betting pattern. That might hurt us, and that's the main reason why they keep delaying conversations. And yes, we're looking into fantasy, but you know, it's all good right now. We're looking at other products, which distract us. We don't want distractions. We don't want our players to be distracted from our main focus, which is sportsbook. Our argument is obviously it will be the opposite.
Yeah.
You know, you are talking to the same player that we want. And there's a lot of cross-selling that can happen. So we're not looking at ways to move your sportsbook player to DFS and take him or her away from sportsbook. We're just trying to keep them longer on the site, as Nicolo rightly said earlier.
Yeah, I was impressed by your presentation, Nicolo, there. It's a couple of arguments that I'm sure you will use in your next sales presentation if you haven't already. So, Nicolo, you obviously run your own site, but do you think that that is the logical way for fantasy sports to live, or is it...
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, obviously, in my experience, what you really need, at least in Europe, is to switch from the season fantasy sport that players are actually playing right now to a daily fantasy sport and a money game. That's really so that investments is probably is the key part. So how much you can spend in advertising this new game and breaking the routine. So I'm not really sure whether a platform with just one game or a multi-gaming platform is what is the crucial in switching from the old-fashioned fantasy game to the new one. I think that the key here is really the educational part. It's just investing and marketing the game. Then you might have an excellent software that goes well with other products, or you might be a single product platform. I don't think that is the key to be successful here. While in the long run, as I said in my presentation, the matchup is so good that you must have both products to increase the revenues, because otherwise somebody else will have fantasy sports and betting, and we do better than you.
Okay, thank you. I'll have two more questions. I think we're, again, a little bit running over. But, Carl, what are the keys to success for the fantasy games in the future?
I think it's finding the right mix, as Nicolo was saying. So you need to have the operators that are ready to give it a shot, take the plunge. Our CEO was basically the founder of a company called Chartwell Technology, which was the first online casino. And when he came into Europe the first time and talked to the operators that had sports books, the reply he used to get was, who the hell would want to play casino at home without the casino experience and everything? And we all know what happened following that. So we believe that this is a similar scenario. We just need that operator to say, that big operator really, to say, okay, I'm going to try this. And then we believe that other operators will follow.
Okay. And John, key to breakthrough here?
Well, we went through the DFS, then we added our own sportsbook and casino, and I think what we found personally is that the DFS or the fantasy sports, not only does it have to be streamlined and easy to use and all those good things, but I think we as a company are using it as a customer acquisition tool and getting engagement and basically going down the route of a free-to-play game where we upsell sportsbook and casino. So we've had the experience in Europe and the UK a few years ago with the DFS, but I think we're going to hand the baton on to the other companies to do that, and we'll take a different approach, which is customer acquisition.
Yeah. So your favorite customer is not necessarily a betting operator.
So it's a betting operator that's looking to acquire customers using a free-to-play fantasy game and then upsell to sportsbook and casino. So it's not detracting anything from. Well, we don't think it would detract anything from the traditional sportsbook bets anyway, but I think used as a acquisition tool as a route we're going down, as opposed to the DraftKings FanDuel model, where you're making revenues from the commissions from the games.
Nicolo, you mentioned investments, and, but I thought, if I understand you correctly, you mean investments in education as well as investment in the marketing of the product. Is it?
Absolutely. I mean, if I can go back to what happened when online poker has been launched, I mean, the first couple of years were huge in investing in marketing, of course, but to educate the players to get to know how the game worked. And then the game was pretty easy to understand, and the same is fantasy sports. I mean, in Italy, only we have an estimate 4 million of players that are playing what is called fantacalcio, which is the seasonal fantasy sport. And the differences are not that big. I mean, we're talking about moving from a journalist mark to online stats. I mean, that's the only huge difference. But you have to do that. You have to spend time and money to make this change, to move those players from a 30-year-old game into the next generation game. So yes, it's a combination of marketing and educational effort.
Okay. We still have a few minutes, so is there anyone again in the audience who would like to ask the panelists a question? Unannounced? Oh, there is one. Great. This one's... Please say introduce yourself.
Sure. So I'm Philip, and I'm aged 24. Question is very simple and fast. For you guys, do you consider that this gap between the Z Nation and the other generation, let's call it, will the older generation suffer from these adaptations that you're doing to the Z Nation? In terms, okay, there are people that like to take their time and take their make their choices with time and be sure with them.
Yeah.
How will that be made possible with all these adjustments that you guys mentioned?
I'll go first there. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. We started off with the 11-a-side desktop-based game, skill game, and it's all skill games. But I think you're right that we don't cater to that anymore just because of our 95% goes on the single game where you choose a team in a matter of seconds. So for us, it was a clear business decision, and we would miss those users out and the ones who are more careful thinking. But I think, again, us as a company and a business, we are focusing on where the volume is for us and where we see the future of, like you say, the Z generation's already outnumbering the millennials. So I think that's what we're targeting in terms of engaging those users, and we will miss out on the more thought group.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think our product is definitely aimed at the younger generation, but obviously the other products are still going to be available. What we're doing is like plugging in another product, even though it's a separate vertical. It goes very well with, I'm not going to repeat again, with Sportsbook mainly. But obviously, yes, those players who you mentioned are not exactly our target audience, or primarily they're not our target audience. It's a bit like smartphones, like replacing the old Nokia phones with huge buttons will always be around, but there's the smartphones as well. So it's just different products for different target audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think in Europe we have the numbers to answer your question. Basically, probably in the US they have such a larger amount of players that can give you a better answer. But in my opinion, we don't really know whether with a larger number of players having a game that takes more time than the 10 seconds that we saw before will stop this young generation from playing. I really think it's a matter of let them basically get them to know the game and try to understand whether they like it first, and then maybe make an adjustment. Do they like to play fantasy sports? Yes. Is the current a layout of fantasy sport platform not exactly fitting their needs, okay, then we will change it. But in my opinion, now they just don't know that fantasy sport exists. So we can't really make some assumptions that might not be true in the end.
Sure.
Thank you. Good question. As you've seen here, the dear panelists, we have some younger audience here today. Could you just super quickly say what their future roles in your companies might be?
Mm-hmm. CEO, come and take my job anytime.
I think it's really good to see that the younger generation is embracing this industry. When I started in gaming, first of all, I had hair. And secondly, I remember it was just people looked negatively at gaming, in Malta at least. So I got out of university and, you know, there was this first gaming company that was going to set up shop in Malta. And I'm like, yeah, okay, I love sports. And that's all the advert said. Are you a sports fanatic? I still remember it. Do you want to try this exciting gaming industry that's setting up in Malta? And now we actually are taking it to the next level. And as we can see, Malta's at a standstill just because of the conference. So.
Yeah, I actually love to see those young people here. I mean, they are the one that will provide new ideas, and that's what we need. I mean, a key point you made before is the actual provider of the games are not one, but maybe 2 or 3 generations older than them, and the gap is too big. I mean, we need their opinions. I mean, their ideas. So I'm really happy to have them there.
Yeah, agreed.
Totally.
Okay. Thank you. You've been a great audience. You've been a great panel. Let's give them a hand, please.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hampus.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola.
Cheers.
And with this, I think there's a break, or am I correct?
We've set the pace on the emerging themes, highlighted the challenges and opportunities, and focused. It's all about millennials now. James Camilleri will propose solutions to the millennial dilemma.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think we don't have a break now, so. Great. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I hope you're finding the conference very interesting so far. I'm pretty sure that all the sportsbook operators have all asked the question, how are we going to engage with millennials? How are we going to actually make them play our product, right? And this is what we are going to talk today about. We're going to talk how we adapt an innovative approach to attract the millennials. But before we start, I want you to actually focus on this number, 35%. What does this represent? According to the Financial Times, by 2020, millennials will represent 35% of the global workforce. 35%. It's quite a big share, right? But not just that. The study also goes on by saying that by 2020, the spending power of the millennials will be the biggest one when compared to the other generations. And it will continue to grow. So what does this mean to sportsbook operators? very simple. It means that there is a lot of opportunity to be exploited with the millennials. It means that the next customer generation for the sportsbook are going to be the millennials. So before we actually see how we're going to attract the millennials, I think it's very important to actually understand what are the gambling habits of the millennials. Because it's important to understand the market or the audience that we're actually going to target. And first and foremost, millennials, they are not high risk takers. I can see here some faces saying, like, okay, why they're not high risk takers? The millennials is a generation that actually faced the financial crisis. So they've seen markets going down. They've seen investments also going down. People losing money. So the hard-earned money that they're actually earning now, they want to ensure that they are investing it properly. This doesn't mean that they are not gamblers. Actually, they are very selective gamblers. They are very highly educated people. And they want to actually play something which really challenges their ability. They want to actually have control somehow, not just by playing RNG games where there is no control. Besides that, millennials, they gamble more, of course, on mobile. We have seen also previously in previous talks that the mobile penetration is very high among the millennials. And an interesting fact is that on average, a millennial look at their phone 100 times per day, which is quite a lot, right? So we've looked at the gambling habits of the millennials, right? And what about the traditional sportsbook, right? How are we offering now? Is our offering catering for the gambling habits of the millennials? And probably if you look at the database of players for a sportsbook, you'll see that there isn't a lot of millennials actually in that particular database. Why is that? Because the product that we're actually offering does not appeal to the millennials. So the answer to that is fantasy sports, right? But we're all talking about fantasy sports, but why fantasy sports is going to be the revenue driver? First and foremost, it is a social game. So the millennials, we've seen that they're all the time on the mobile. And what are they doing on the mobile? Everyone is on social media, posting pictures, connecting with friends, talking about what I'm doing. And this is about what is fantasy sports. Fantasy sports is I'm creating my dream team, and I'm sharing it with my friends. And I'm actually asking my friends to challenge me, create a dream team. Also, and let's gather together, let's create a tournament, and we challenge one another. So it's all about the social aspect in fantasy sports, which is something that the millennials, they actually embrace. Besides that, we also have seen that millennials, they are not high risk takers. So fantasy sports is the perfect tool for them because it offers them the ability to bet low amounts, but with the opportunity to win massive prize pools. Furthermore, fantasy game, as we have seen, is a skill-based game. It's all about statistics. And the millennials, they love statistics because they are very, very well educated. So they want something, they want to play a game that will challenge their knowledge. So fantasy sports. Okay, so fantasy sports is something that we're saying that is good for the millennials to actually acquire the millennials. But how is that versus the traditional sportsbook? Does this mean that the revenues that are being generated on the sportsbook are going to die and are going to be replaced by fantasy sports? I would say no. Fantasy sports is going to add another revenue stream for the sportsbook operators. Not just that, fantasy sports is going to be actually the driver that will also fuel more revenues into the sportsbook. But let's see how this can be done. So if you take a look at my fantasy team here, you can see that you can say a lot about me as a fantasy player. You can say that, you know, I'm a Man United fan because I've put in Lukaku as a striker, and it means that maybe I believe that he is going to score, or, you know, Man United, they're going to win. Or I believe that, you know, the goalkeeper here that I've put in, he's going to have a clean sheet. Or the team that he's actually playing with, they're going to win. So you can get, from a fantasy player, you can get a lot of information that a normal sportsbook can't get. So the innovation is going to happen with this information that we're actually collecting. Because imagine a situation where you have a fantasy player, you know a lot of things about this player through his team that he's actually putting in on a daily basis, and you want to attract him to sportsbook. And by the use of artificial intelligence, by looking at all this information, you are then, once they enter a tournament, you will then suggest a bet slip, right, that actually caters for his preferences. So if I have a preference for a particular team, and I believe that that team is actually going to win, make me win the prize pool, then I will be more inclined to actually place a bet on the actual sportsbook. And this is where fantasy sports is going to drive more revenues into the sportsbook, because it will allow the sportsbook operators to tap into demographics that at the moment they are not being reached to, and reel them into the sportsbook through fantasy sports. So, as a summary, we've said that millennials, they are not high risk takers. They are very selective gamblers and gamble more on mobile. However, fantasy sports is a social game. It allows millennials to actually interact socially. It provides low bet amounts with the ability to win big prize pools. And besides that, it is a skill-based game, which complements a lot with the gambling habits of the millennials. Thank you very much.
Let's look into the future. Jorn Felby is our next generation fantasy sports guru.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to listen to me talk about the next generation of fantasy sports betting. As you probably noticed, I'm from the same company as James, who was just speaking, and I'm going to focus more on what's to come on the fantasy genre. Quick about me. I'm currently the product operations officer of Scott Gaming Group, and I was also one of the founders of the company. Founded in 2013, Bergen, Norway, which is not traditionally where sports betting companies are coming from. We're listed on the Nasdaq First North, which is based in Stockholm. We currently hold 4 offices, one in Bergen, one in Stockholm, one here in Malta, and one in Lviv. And we're just reached 80 employees, and we're growing rapidly. Our journey so far, we started off thinking that fantasy sports in Europe would be a B2C operation. We started building an MVP. We also got a Maltese license and tried our luck becoming the next DraftKings or FanDuel, if you like, in Europe. We soon realized that one of the biggest challenges is the difference between UK and Spain and Norway and Sweden even. So there's a lot of localization when it comes to preferences of sports and what drives fantasy. So after a few years, we decided to switch routes and take a look at what we could do in cooperation with existing sports books. But we're not here about talking about what has been. We're here to talk about what is coming. Sorry. So, whenever I've been at these kind of conferences before and fantasy sports has been discussed, every time there's this, well, word or theme that comes up, it's big data. But in this particular situation, we're talking about data going into the game and not the data that actually comes out on the other side. I'm not going to say that the focus has been wrong before, but I think my belief is that a simpler version of the game, which is easier to access and understand for everybody, doesn't necessarily require the big data that the American sports got going. What I'm much more interested in, though, is the data coming out of the fantasy sports. James, he had his example of a traditional fantasy team, what you're seeing here. I'm going to try and break down one of the products that we're launching so it's easy to understand what this actually does. Now, our products sits best in correlation or in cooperation, if you like, with an existing sports book. So when a user creates his team, it's quite obvious from this picture that, okay, 3 defensive players from Manchester United and the same from Wolverhampton, 2 forward players going for Manchester City. So we built a software that analyzes all these teams at an instant so that we understand what this user expects from the upcoming round. So essentially, when a user creates a fantasy team, he's technically delivering you a questionnaire of what he expects, or she for that matter, expects is going to happen in the upcoming round. So technically, they're telling us who they believe will score, who they will believe that doesn't get any goals against, and so forth. You can also build a really strong case for understanding which is this player's favorite team, which obviously what sports they're into, and so forth. So Scout Gaming Group, we created a software that we like to call BetFlex, which analyzes all this into a split second. And at the next level, we're going to offer them instantly odds on their already pre-selected picks from the fantasy team. So a couple of my colleagues have already talked about, sorry, go away, fly. My previous colleagues has already talked about the conversion between fantasy sports players and sportsbook players. And this system here makes it possible to do that in an instant. Or you can even store the information and target this information for the user later. So at this particular image that we're looking on now, if I could go back, you would have seen that the user created the fantasy team. He had David De Gea as a goalkeeper. Now, the next phase, he gets odds for David De Gea to do better than, for example, Kepa, which is the Chelsea keeper, or Hugo Lloris, which is the Tottenham keeper. I'm going to come back to how these odds are panned out. But initially, what you have here is a suggestion of a sports bet, which the fantasy user has already decided he will be performing better than the other keepers in this particular case. So you're selling something that the user already decided will happen. And this is just an example. It could just have well been two or three strikers, which is sort of covered here by the bet slips post, is what's coming next. And that is the suggested bet slip. This is also something that is taken straight out of the team you're submitting. It doesn't matter if it's a season game or if it's a daily fantasy game or even if it's just a single match game. The software understands what the user is thinking and is converting it into sports bets, which can be cross-sold on the spot or at a later stage, if that makes more sense. Like, for example, for the World Cup, if you have a user picking mostly players from Spain, and they go through to the quarterfinal or the playoffs, you're going to expect that this user is interested in betting on Spain. I admit, maybe he is Spanish, maybe he has, maybe he thinks the Spanish team is playing the best football or whatever. But we're learning a lot about what the fantasy user is actually expecting or hoping or thinking might happen. So some of you now might be starting to think, but okay, we cannot bring in another source. We already have an existing sportsbook. How does this product sit with our current offering? And that's one of the neat tricks. We are cooperating with the sportsbook feed providers, where I'm not going to name any names, but you'll probably guess who I'm talking about. And these are going to be a third party, so it's still going to be their sportsbook odds coming into this. It's just going to be the BetFlex module making the whole what do we sell to this player a hell of a lot easier. As an example, during the World Cup, being from Norway, which I hope you don't hold against me, we did a cooperation with TV2 and NRK, which is two of the biggest TV stations in Norway. Now, we're only 5 million people in Norway and some pocket change, and we managed to get 100,000 users. Any user could only have one team. And with 100,000 users, each spending 8 minutes and 30 seconds on average per session, and when you get 40 million sessions, you can imagine the power this kind of information would give you in a cross-selling situation. So for me, personally, I think this is one of the steps that will bring sportsbook and fantasy sports closer together. And since fantasy sports is content-driven, obviously the cooperation with media houses is also something to look deeply into. I'm not going to say that much more about this, but I'll move along to the next topic, which is expected fantasy points. Some of you might be familiar with the term expected goals, which is constantly mentioned in Sky Sports or anybody who's offering soccer these days. Now, what expected fantasy points does is taking this a little bit further along. So by building odds models that calculate all the potential outcomes of a match, we're able to pinpoint the break point where, for example, a player is expected to get 8.7 points in this particular match. Now you say, that might not be that impressive. And I agree. But if you're able to make this into a binary proposition so that you can offer your user the opportunity to bet if it's, more than 3 points, more than 4 points, maybe you even expect them to get negative points, and instantly providing the odds, even if you combine the bets, well, then you have sort of created a new line for proposition betting, which is very interesting, since proposition betting obviously is bigger in the States and in American sports at this point in time, where you can see if you go to any sports book, you can bet on Messi getting 1, 2, or 3 goals or 0 goals in a match. But with this kind of system where you know what the expectations are, you can match up, for example, Cristiano Ronaldo and Messi in a fantasy duel with real odds. And you can even handicap it if you like, because you know the potential odds for the different outcomes. So for the expected fantasy points, you could even create an environment where the user could select anybody versus anybody. Of course, if you pick a left back of Swindon versus Aguero, your odds would not be very good. But at the end of the day, you could allow the user to feel that they're creating a market from themselves. but technically it's just based on mathematical algorithms calculating what is the most highly possible outcome. Already mentioned that fantasy users, people before me, they spend a lot more time, of course, online or actively checking their results or, finding new games to participate in or whatever. And the time spent, if you're a regular sportsbook player, you're going to go in, you're going to place your bet for Lukaku to score, and you're going to go to the pub and watch the game. And if Lukaku scores, you win. If he doesn't score, you lose. And it's very easy. It doesn't demand any maintenance, so to speak. While in a fantasy game, you're always going to be interested in looking at what can happen next that will improve my position and so forth, which is obviously also opens up a lot of doors for cross-selling. There was also made a comparison towards poker. And with a poker background myself, I can't disagree with this. There's a lot of similar factors, but there is one thing that also was touched on that does not compare completely to this, because at the poker table, you're always there. The next hand is coming, they're running along. While in a fantasy game, you can just submit your team and you're done. Another challenge for especially soccer fantasy is that if you have a single game, there is not enough events happening to make it an interesting game. But that changes a lot when you introduce live fantasy. Basically, we're speeding up the process. You can make in-game decisions, which eventually leads to the player being online for the entire match. And you can probably imagine what kind of combinations you can use with this kind of product with the already existing one that I just showed you, where you offer bets based on what the player is actually doing. So you could say that while a live fantasy tournament is running, your team sucks. You're doing all the changes that you want, but things are just not going your way. But there is a sports bet right next to it who is suggested based on your own decisions that can make you a winner if, Fellaini scores that 90-minute winner. So the potential here is split into different parts. First of all, you're going to keep your user active and playing during the games, which we're not seeing today. Although they're monitoring, they're not doing much activity except monitoring. And monitoring doesn't really generate that much money. So with this and the cross-selling opportunities, you're going to have a completely different audience, perhaps these young guys who are more into esports and things that happens fast. See this kind of product might sit well with them. I haven't discussed this with these guys, but they're used to things happening fast. And of course, by live betting, you can also introduce the options to cash out. Your team is doing well. And it doesn't have to be against other players. You can even play this game against the house if you have enough data. And that is the data that we're looking for. Not the data that's going into the game, but the data that comes out on the other end. And we also heard Gordon speaking about fantasy being an acquisition tool. Yeah, you could say that, but it doesn't have to be just that. It can be an acquisition tool. It can be a cross-selling tool. And it can also be a revenue driving its own worth if we just get the numbers high enough to reach the general population, which has kind of been the struggles for Europe so far, if we're honest with ourselves. I think that was what I had to say. I hope that it made sense and it was interesting to see what is coming from our end at Scout Gaming Group. And I thank you for your attention.
He's come all the way from Scotland. John Gordon will shout out from the Highlands about the DFS Ultimate Customer Acquisition Tool.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks for your time today. I'm John Gordon, the CEO of Incentive Games, and I'm here to talk about customer acquisition and how fantasy sports is the ultimate tool for customer acquisition. So a little bit about me. In fact, that looks more like Ricky Martin than me, but I was living in Trinidad and Tobago, working for BP, when I came up with the idea of fantasy sports betting. I knew that in the UK they loved fantasy sports and they loved betting, so I came back to the UK in 2013, founded Premier Punt, which was a B2C fantasy football betting company, and we began our operation. So the motto for Premier Punt was for the fans, by the fans, avid football fans, and we thought we could create the perfect product, gamifying football matches and engaging the user and make some good money off of it. But as we spoke about today, there's several barriers to entry, especially in a mature betting market in Europe and the UK, where users are just used to instant gratification, betting on their phone and a click of a button. Manchester United to beat Chelsea in the pub, £100 done. So the first barrier to entry was at desktop first, and we started with a 11-a-side fantasy football game, take a couple hours to choose your team, and it was just too time consuming. So that was the second barrier to entry. It was fine in the US, where there was not, at the time obviously, there was no traditional sportsbook betting, as that was illegal. So it was a way the US user was used to taking their time and choosing a team methodically. And then, but that also meant that the ones that did that, they had the edge if they took 2 or 3 hours as opposed to someone on their phone. So imagine trying to condense. I looked over in America and I could see that they had these apps that was trying to condense the 11-a-side game into a phone. And you've got hundreds of players to choose from, thousands of statistics. So even if you were to choose a team on your phone, it was just literally taking too long, and you weren't going to have a good team at the end. And then the third thing, which the guys have touched on a lot today, is education. So even though fantasy sports was big in the UK, and it is and around Europe, and betting is, the DFS wasn't so prevalent, and it was going to take a long time for us to really get the message out there. But what we did as Premier Punt is we broke down some of these barriers. We made it mobile first, so we condensed that weekly, daily game into a single game, made it 6 players, choose 6 players from 22. No player valuations, just 2 star players from each side, and you could choose a team really quickly and easily. We made a point scoring system for every single action, so every pass, every tackle, it was quite high volume of moving up and down the leaderboard every kick of the ball. So we did that, which then meant that we could reduce the time it would take for a user to be able to choose a team. And then after time, word got around, and the education piece was easy done through word of mouth. So that was great, and we had initial success. We were ranking up with the household names in the download charts. We were the #1 searched app in the App Store, and it took us less than £1,000 to do that. And all the users were loving the app. It was fantastic. It was a huge success for us as a really lean startup, and great reviews from the end users all over social media. But the bottom line wasn't there for us. So although we had all this revenue and traction, and our marketing was tiny, our marketing budget was tiny, we got a lot of return, we didn't make any operating profit. We saw what was happening in the US, the high volumes. You know, they were doing big pots, and some throughout the UK companies were putting big pots in to get players in, unfilled pots, so even the commission that they were making wasn't enough. So a lot of these companies have either gone bust or changed their focus to B2B. And what we found is that essentially the operating cost and the cost per acquisition outweighed the lifetime value of the user. So we had to really think of how we were going to change our offering. And similar to what Scout guys are doing, where we look at the user's six-a-side version and we upsell sportsbook bets. So this is a basketball version where they've got Kevin Irvin in a team, and then we'll get Kevin Irvin to score the first basket or whatever the case may be. So we got our own sportsbook in the UK, and we upsold these bets, and we had a great conversion rate. We then cross-fertilized it with casino. So as a lot of the guys were saying earlier, it's hard to convince these operators to do this, and there was no real metrics for this. So we thought, instead of trying to convince the operators, we'll do it ourselves. So we got our own sportsbook and casino license, and we offered it ourselves, and we cross-fertilized ourselves, and we got our own metrics. And our lifetime in the customer went through the roof. So we see this as the way forward for us as a business. So that then became the pivot. So we were B2C, fantasy sports, Premier Punt, and we're now incentive games. With the help of some advisors, investors in the industry, namely one of them is Victor Chandler, who's come on board and really helped us focus into what we are good at delivering, which is viral games. But incentive games itself, what our three main pillars which we deliver is a reduced cost per acquisition. So in the iGaming industry in the UK, it was £150 to acquire a user for Sportsbook, and we got that down to £4.10. With our weekly free-to-play games and engaging games, we could retain the user more efficiently, coming back every week to play these games or during the week, and add in other sports so the users can come back time and time again. And then the upsell. So upsell, cross-sell to sportsbook and casino, which we've got a proven track record for. And us at Incentive Games, it's all about acquire, retain, and monetize. Or as we like to say, play, stay, and pay. And those three symbols are combined for our logo of Incentive Games. But when we're creating these games, as I touched on before, it's not just creating a game for game's sake. We now look at the neuroscience behind the games. And to get your end user, your end customer who's going to consume your game, they need to have three things at all times. They need to have the motivation, they need to have the ability, and they need a trigger. And that's the three things you need to create a viral game. Let me explain how that works in terms of an everyday situation. If your phone rings, and you hear the phone ring, so you've got a trigger, you've got the ability to answer it, but you see it's your ex-wife or your current boyfriend or whatever the case may be, and you decide not to answer it. So then you're not going to get that end behavior that you were looking for. Similarly, if someone important phones, like Victor Chandler, you hear the phone ringing, but it's at the bottom of your bag. You don't have the ability to reach it. Therefore, the behavior of answering the phone doesn't happen. And again, if someone important is calling, you've got the ability, the phone's in your pocket, but your phone's on silent, then there is no trigger. So when we're creating games, it really is all around those three pillars to create a viral game. And I just want to labour this point a little bit on the trigger piece, the ability and motivation. So if you adapt it to our games, at the start, you've got the external trigger. So marketing of a product, so a free-to-play fantasy football game. Now, you want that just to be at the start. You don't want to be paying for advertising forever. You want your game to go viral. So you have the external trigger at the start, and then it becomes internal. We've got a push notification. The person's on the phone. They see your app icon. That's internal. But then to really create a habitual app, it needs to be within the person's brain. You know, creating a hooked app is, they see that Manchester United are playing Chelsea. They don't wait for the push. They know to go to your phone, to their phone to play your app. The ability piece is really crucial as well. The ability is how easily can you make it for them to do what you want them to do. And that's what you'll see one of our videos later, within a matter of seconds. And that's why I'm so key in that, is that it has to be within a few seconds for them to do that. And then the motivation, that's really key, and that's a whole subject in itself. But for us, it's really nice and easy. It's free to play to win real money. And that's where we get the motivation piece. And those three things are crucial. But then how is that adapted to cross-selling to Sportsbook? there's no trigger required because it's already upsold to them. They can see it. Similarly with the ability, so it couldn't be any easier because we have a bet slip there, bet now, and then the motivation. They've chosen certain players. You're trying to reach into their brain and say, put £10 on this to win 50 or 4,000 or whatever the case may be. So our clients, we work with operators, media companies, and affiliates. And we basically, it's a menu sort of choice for the clients. We basically say, choose a game, one of our typical games, either Fantasy Dream Team, free-to-play fantasy game, a pick'em, predict the outcome of a match or so, several matches, or a swipe game which we've developed, which can be topical. Will Simon Cowell have a standing ovation on the X Factor to write yes or no? So the client would choose a game, then they choose a sport, so we can adapt it to basketball, baseball, American football, and then an integration method. So we can have it as an option in the client's main app where they can access a game seamlessly, or we have a standalone game where the client can promote, and then we upsell to their products. And this is just a video of the game, one of the fantasy games that we have. I'll show you how easy it is. Simply choose a match. The user chooses 6 players, no player valuations, as I said. And they can see the predicted lineups and the starting lineup. And that's it. We then look at their selection and we upsell bets. So Lukaku in your team, Lukaku to score the first goal. Man United to win 13-2. So it really is as easy as that. And this is how it would look if, it's not quite on there, but the user journey. So if it was in the client's app here, they would press a button, seamlessly come to our game. The user would choose their lineup, and if they liked, we have the bet slip here, and if they hit the place bet, it comes back to the parent app with the pre-populated bet slip. And then again, when the game is in play, the user's in there checking their fantasy team selection, and on the right-hand side you can see live betting for, if it's basketball, who's going to win the quarter, and so on. And again, place a bet and back to the main app. So that's my presentation, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Gordon, the CEO of Incentive Games. I'd like to thank you for your time.
Millennials and the future is one brewing pot of interesting conversation. Michele Macro moderating. Carl Grech, Marco Castaldo, and Alessio Crisantemi will cook up this flavorful recipe.
Hello all. Sorry. Thank you for sticking with us till the last minute. My name is Michele and I'll be your host for the last panel for this evening. Carl, Marco, and Alessio will be joining me shortly. Yeah?
Sorry.
And James?
Okay, come on.
Okay, so we have a panel of distinguished guests, B2B operators, and a journalist as well, from mix from both Malta and Italy, so hopefully we can give you a good insight. We'll try to keep this discussion casual. Any questions, we'll try and have some question time towards the end. So, okay, shall we start with brief introductions? Maybe start off with Carl. Carl has been around for a very long time, 18 years in the iGaming industry. He's actually one of the first employees in the iGaming sector back in 2000. He's gone to different operators. He's worked with casino, sportsbook. He's been a trader in a sportsbook, poker, and now DFS. Marco is with Microgame, managing director of Microgame. James from Scouts Group, that you've already heard from previously, and Alessio from gioconews.it, which is one of the premier portals, media portals in Italy. If you'd like to give a brief introduction about each of your roles and your experiences with DFS, maybe we can start with you, James.
Yes, I'm James. I work for Scout Gaming Group. We are a B2B provider of fantasy sports and pool betting games. We operate globally, essentially. Yes, I mean, we've seen that fantasy sports is actually really picking up in Europe, but also in Asia. And definitely there is a lot of opportunities for sportsbook providers to actually provide a product completely different, but at the same time complement the sportsbook offering.
Thank you. Alessio, so what do you do at Gioco News, and how does fantasy sports figure into that?
Yes, Gioco News is a network, Italian network, dedicated to the gaming and gambling market. And on Gioco News network, we have a special section about DFS. And when the market of DFS started in Italy also, we launched a Facebook page about DFS. The name of this page is Daily Fantasy Sports Gioco News. And it's interesting that after 1 week, maybe 10 days maybe, we had just 1,000 followers on this page, because the launch of DFS have a really enthusiasm in the first time. Okay.
Carl?
Okay, I'm Carl. I work for a company called Global Daily Fantasy Sports. It was founded in 2016. We are a B2B only DFS supplier. We have launched our network in Italy, and Marco is one of our esteemed clients. Our next step will be launching our .com market. We've got a Malta license now, and we're also working on markets outside Europe, like Asia, Latin America, and others.
And Marco?
So Microgame is Italy's leading B2B provider for online gaming and for land-based betting shops. We provide full turnkey service, including all verticals, and that includes Italy's biggest poker network, Italy's biggest bingo network, and we're hoping to create Italy's biggest DFS network in partnership with Carl's company and some others.
Thank you. So to start off, Carl, from your experiences in other sectors, in poker and casino, sportsbook, how is a DFS player different to a traditional punter?
Okay, that's a good question. First of all, it's a younger demographic we are targeting here. We've already had this discussion earlier. We're looking at the newer players coming into the gaming space. They're essentially going to be sports fans. I think many of us, if not all of us, have our favorite team. But the difference between DFS and the normal sports book is that usually, well, or not usually, but if you're someone like me who's going to bet on your favorite team, you're going to watch that match and it ends there. With DFS, the advantage is that you can have an interest in a whole daily program. For example, like if there's 8 Champions League matches, you're going to have players in all of those matches, or most of those matches. So you're going to be watching more than just your team's match. You're going to be engaged. You're going to be on a website. You're going to be on your phone. You're going to be checking the live stats for all those matches. So there's a different level of engagement to other verticals.
And content plays a really big role in that, because we've seen from traditional, I guess, you get YouTube channels, you get Twitter accounts with all the tips of what you can do or can't do, that normally don't go into that level of detail with sportsbooks. So as an industry itself, it has this subsector within it that actually generates content, media, tips. Who's the best player for this week? What should you look out for? I mean, you get it for sportsbook, obviously, but not to the level of detail that I've seen in traditional media. Yep. James, would you care to weigh into that?
Yes, you're right. Fantasy sports is all about content, it's all about statistics. And this also makes it a perfect tool, not just for sportsbook operators, but also for affiliates, right? Because when you actually talk about sports, you're usually talking about how the players are actually performing. So if you take a newspaper, they talk about how the players are going to perform. Even at an individual level, we talk about, I believe that player is going to score, or that player is going to actually also score. So this drives a lot of content, and this is something that affiliates also would like to actually have, because with all this content, then people can get more engaged, and by getting more engaged, then fantasy sports comes into play.
We spoke previously throughout this conference about conversion and player acquisition, but what about... Okay, so what is the distinction between multi-channel? DFS is a multi-channel vertical within an existing operator, or single-channel website. What works best? I mean, we've seen what happens in the US, but obviously that's limited by regulation. However, Europe is a different thing. If I had to take a comparison with, say, for example, another burgeoning industry, esports and esports betting, you have companies doing well that's actually cross-sell across different sport types in sports betting. But then you also have websites specific on esports betting and nothing else. How does that factor into fantasy sports, not just within its own niche, but also as a product in view of casino convertibility? Carl, maybe you can take this one?
Well, our view as a company, and hence our strategy, is that this product works better when it's one vertical of an operator, so including all the cross-selling, and it's all about liquidity. So it's very similar to poker, where obviously the more players you have taking part in the contest, the more exciting the product becomes, the more engagement there is, the more chance of banter, the more social interaction. You can invite friends over to your league, and you can communicate while you're playing, while the matches are on. So I think a key feature is going to be not repeating the mistakes that happened in the poker world, like, for example, the famous sharks and fish. So what we've done as a company, for example, is that we've created a skill matching, whereby the system will just collect all the head-to-heads. So you submit a head-to-head, I submit a head-to-head, Marco does as well. We collect all those head-to-heads, and right before the start of the contest, the system will match you up with players that are similar to your level. So
you rate players from past experience?
Yes, obviously the more they play, the better our rating system is going to be, but you're basically building the rating system of each player, and you basically prolong the lifespan of that player. You don't get killed automatically right away because I never win, I've never got a chance to make any money. So you keep the player in the ecosystem.
And can you do that across the network, or just for one website? Or
No. We can do that across the network, but we also have the option for any operator to say, okay, like tonight I've got a big promotion, so I want my players to just play between themselves. So we can ring fence the contest for that operator specifically.
Okay. Marco, what about the Italian DFS market? How do you see it? what has been your experience thus far?
I think the Italian DFS experience so far is an interesting study in contradictions, because on the one hand we have a country, well, we have a saying that every Italian is a football manager, that every Italian loves to second guess the national coach and so on. And we also have a very old traditional newspaper-based fantasy football game in Italy that has more than 1 million regular users. So you'd expect DFS to fly in a country like Italy, but the truth is not so immediate. It's not so simple. It's proving a bit of a challenge to get the market off the ground, and that's for many reasons. One is related to what we were saying before. I mean, DFS because DFS fits into the regulated gambling kind of sphere. You know, it goes on websites of regulated operators, and that already creates an access barriers for certain types of players. So it's not clear it's easy to acquire those players that have a propensity for the game. And the other issue is that the market is growing very, very fast. The online market is growing very, very fast. We're seeing growth rates in sports betting of over 30% a year. And so operators are focused on those verticals that are flying, and and until we crack how to fit DFS in terms of cross-selling into the broader picture, the irony is that while players find the game very engaging, operators don't get so engaged because they have many, many other priorities. So I really believe there's tremendous potential in the market, but we need to make this traditional fantasy football customer base, or at least a section of it, cross with the regulated gambling sort of customer base, and that requires tailoring the product to some extent that we're working on.
However, we in previous speeches we actually discovered that there are 4 million active Italian customers in free-to-play Fantacalcio.
Yes. Yeah.
Is it about apart from cross-selling, is it also about monetization though? Because fantasy sports is an extremely popular product when it comes to free-to-play. I think the challenge is more when it comes to getting customers to pay to actually monetize a product. So is it maybe that operators need to find a different way of how to engage with existing DFS customers? Maybe even, you get these fantasy sports apps for teams like Real Madrid and other teams for the specific Premier League or Serie A, etc. Is it maybe that operators could try and partner up maybe with these big networks themselves?
So I think there are many different aspects of this that need to be defined and managed, and the industry needs to invest in several different areas. I mean, one is seeing how the existing customer bases of online gambling operators can be converted to take up this game. And so far, I think the result is that you really see only the aficionados. It's very difficult to get action from casual players, which is really what we want, to create a sustainable network with a good ecology. So that means that operators need to think about how to attract the rest of the world, those who play the free-to-play game. And nobody's cracked that nut yet, and the investment that requires, and of course things like skins that are linked to football teams. All of those are things that have been thought about, in some cases tried in the past, but we don't yet see the industry massively investing in it. That's the issue.
Understood. Alessio, maybe you want to give your shot about the Italian DFS market?
Yes, I believe that the DFS market in Italy has yet to express its potential. As Marco explained, sure we must look at the Italian reality and the gaming offer that is present in Italy today to better understand the landscape we are talking about. In our country, we now play anywhere and at any time of the day, and the player can choose between slot machine, VLT, online gaming, lottery, scratch and win, a lot of game. In this landscape, the DFS rank as one of the last offers on the market. So the Italian scenario is very different from that of United States. You know, we can take the same boom for DFS. Because in my opinion, I'm agree with Marco that the first competitor maybe are the sports betting, because where you can bet on the final match or the final result of a match is a betting too fast, too easy. But having said that, I also believe that when we talk about fantasy sports, that's a different matter. What I have just said, in fact, is valid to the usual players. So those of which we already know the attitude and the preferences, but we don't know exactly what those who today are not regular players want. And I think that we have to work here because the DFS could represent that kind of game suitable for users who are not already better today. Looking at the consumption of Italians in general, it results that consumption in other products other than gambling is remarkable. For example, we are the country that spend more on domestic video game. So there is a propensity to spend on entertainment. And this probably could be picked up by fantasy sports. For this reason, I'm sure that there is still a lot to do in our country in this sector. Even the first results have not been amazing. I think that we simply have to direct the offer in terms of marketing and communication to another public, different from that of the other games. And even if it will never become the main activity for Italian operators, it could still obtain an important place, even if addressing a niche. I'm sure that the DFS could be a niche, not a colossal games, and not the first segment for a gaming operator, but it could be an opportunity for gain other players.
Thank you, Alessio. And also, possibly very relevant to the Italian market, is the ring fencing that is actually prevalent in Italy. If you're an Italian operator, Italian licensed operator, you can't have the same pool, liquidity pool, with other players, other non-Italian players. So what's the update on that? Have there been material changes to the status quo? Are you seeing the agreement between regulators progressing? And does it limit, how much does it limit liquidity?
Okay, you open up a can of worms with this one. Because I'm going to say something that's kind of unpopular, maybe counterintuitive, but I really believe that the propaganda around shared liquidity has led to kind of a collective conventional wisdom that is somehow far from the truth. Okay, so I think there are many reasons. Obviously, we don't have time to go into it here, but I'd love to have a panel about international liquidity to share all the thinking and analysis. But it's true that games with liquidity, obviously, if you have more liquidity, the game will be more attractive. But for that statement to translate, putting liquidity together between different markets with different rules, different regulatory structures, and without a properly managed ecology of the market will lead the market to grow, I think is wrong. So in actual practice, let's set aside DFS, which is a nascent market in Italy. The poker market, I strongly believe, if the agreement to pool liquidity with the other 3 European countries, which was signed at the letter of intent stage, if that had gone through, I strongly believe the Italian market would have actually declined over the medium term. Because, you know, liquidity beyond a certain level is an effect, it's not a cause. You know, a market will thrive if the structure of the offer is such that you have balanced ecology. If the market is such that you can generate liquidity flows, drastic liquidity flows between different pools, you can create huge damage. So the situation in Europe is, it's just not even conceivable to pool liquidity between a market like Italy, where an operator in Italy can only provide games to citizens with an Italian fiscal code, with a market like Spain, where players from all over the world can play, or France. And we already see the results of what's happening. You know, the French regulator pushed this and is now realizing that it's draining liquidity out of France. Because, of course, PokerStars pooled all their .eu players into Spain, and you know, where the taxes are lower than in France. So if you don't think this stuff through, you're just setting yourself up for disaster, pooling liquidity. And I think many people in the Italian market, and politicians especially, realize this and said, wait, stop. Because the other key element is, in a market like poker, where collusion and fraud is a huge issue, where already it's difficult to police collusion within the Italian market, what are we going to do when people are playing across the table from someone registered in Spain, but who's in Brazil or in Venezuela? I mean, what's the authority who's going to go after the funds? And how is that going to work? And if you don't think this stuff through, I mean, it's just foolish to think that you can do something like this. Anti-money laundering is another issue. So what I'm saying here is that while there's some logic to pool, there's another aspect as well, which is industry structure. I mean, competition. Obviously, if pooling liquidity generates total dominion by one player, you know, you don't have to think too hard that over time, if that player continues to base his strategies on value, you know, and feeding professionals and sharks, that's ultimately gonna reduce liquidity. So what I'm trying to say is this is very complicated, you know, and it's not a magic bullet solution. In poker especially, it's very controversial, and that means it's not likely to happen for DFS either. But for DFS, the same thing holds true. I think the first issue we need to crack is how do we attract players in Italy to actually play the game before we start, you know, linking them to, you know, creating liquidity is not the solution right now. Further on down the line, it might be. Just an ironic note, you know, that we did a study of the ring-fenced Italian market over 5 years, and the open to shared liquidity.com market declined much faster than the Italian market. So what is this, you know? Does liquidity equals no? And why did it decline? We know why, you know, because poker was cannibalized by casino games, and poker tanked because, you know, liquidity flows to professional players essentially drove people out of the business. So that's the issue. Fix that issue, then maybe we can talk about liquidity. Create an even playing field in terms of rules, and maybe then we can talk about shared liquidity. But guys, this is stuff that's complicated. It needs to be done right. It can't be done simplistically. Coming back to DFS, once again, if we get people to really latch on to the appeal of the game and we start to see numbers in Italy, then we can start talking about whether the liquidity is sufficient or we need to pool it with somebody else. But until we have that step, I don't see what the advantage is.
So let's talk a bit about the evolution of the game. We saw certain new permutations of different products. James, maybe what is the future of the specific product? Is it making it more skill-based, more complicated, maybe to elevate the skill ceiling, or maybe make it simpler, easier to understand, lower the number of variables, lower the number of players that you choose within a field? What's it like? What's your feeling?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Marco. I mean, the situation that there is in Italy, I think it's also in Europe, where the DFS is still growing. It's not like the US, where the US players, they know how to play fantasy sports because they've been playing it for a number of years. But in Europe, we need to make sure that we actually engage players into fantasy sports. And doing fantasy sports or doing fantasy sports games that are more complex, definitely that is not going to help to acquire more players. So I think that having different variants, making the game simpler, right, for the casual players to actually come in and play, then that's the first step. So once you do that, then you can start looking into how you're going to actually make money out of those players.
And that is true both for international liquidity, but also for countries like Italy, like Spain, for example, that are also regulated. I mean, we've seen in Spain, for example, it is a regulated market, it is ring-fenced, and we've seen that because we are offering a simple fantasy game there in Spain, people are actually hooked up to that game. People are more interested to actually play that game and socialize with their peers. So definitely having a simple game, which is will drive more users into fantasy sports. What about the social elements, though? Yeah, Marco?
No, I just wanted to add another issue about liquidity, which is I think it's healthy for the industry to think in terms of engagement and entertainment of the players rather than huge prize pools. I mean, we're living a time of tremendous political pressure on the gambling industry, and I think it makes sense for us to invest in those games which engage players over a long period of time, over perhaps small sums of money, and not get fixated on it has to be the gazillion euro prize pool, which is what liquidity is about to some extent, and which is, let's face it, it's politically very unpopular. That's one of the other reasons the shared pooled liquidity idea in Italy didn't get political favor.
Social elements. What can be done to maybe make the game really more social? Because poker was one of the minor things, I guess, that didn't help the game. But yeah, how do you make a social DFS game that you have players interacting with each other, but avoiding anything like collusion or anything of the sort, not jeopardizing the anti-fraud business? James, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of making a game more sociable, again, having fantasy sports that allow users or players to actually create their own tournaments, for instance. So, you're a group of friends, they want to compete against each other, they create a fantasy tournament, and they actually compete against each other. That brings, of course, that brings out the social element. But besides that, it also provides a platform where players can go in and play whatever they want to. And besides that, the advantage of operators then will be that they will have players that are more engaged. So then even from a brand awareness, those players will be more loyal to that particular brand.
Yeah, also, however, I'm talking about things like gamification and things like that, because creating a tournament, all that stuff, it's been done. But what about, we saw what Generation Z is all about, and how it's not just about the money, but it's also about what you can show. So something like a different avatar that shows that you're a more skilled player, progression system. So basically, gamification of what a traditional DFS website would look at. Should that be part of the plans of operators?
Yes, definitely. But I think that we are at a stage, specifically in Europe, where we need to engage players into fantasy sports. So doing gamification will actually, yes, help out to increase more players, but we need to make sure that at this stage we have a number of players that are actually know what fantasy is, they are aware of fantasy sports, and they will need to first start playing more fantasy sports, and then move on into gamification.
All right. Okay, so we've run out of time, but if there are any questions from the audience, we'll be happy to take them now. Okay, Jeffrey, yeah?
Hi, thank you all for your opinions. I found the discussion exciting and very interesting to listen to. I just want to comment on the shared liquidity topic. I think that there's a lot of benefits of shared liquidity in various markets, in particular around player experience. We have a dozen players in Germany who right now are playing NHL contests. There's no way that somebody would go seek to create a compelling experience for them. Otherwise, we have Canadian Football League players in Australia and in the UK who are playing with our shared liquidity. I mean, there's an opportunity for them to be able to legally play a gaming experience in their jurisdiction as a result of shared liquidity. Otherwise, there would be no experience available for them in their jurisdiction. So from a user experience perspective, I think there's a lot of benefits around liquidity. Also, a lot of the issues you were talking about for poker, I don't feel necessarily apply in respect to daily fantasy sports because it's not an RNG game, firstly, and the results are very clearly determined through a set of publicly available statistics. You know, one might argue the applicability of even blockchain here, but I feel that smart regulation is something that, you know, we can have some synchronization around, and the only issues to really address would be in respect to tax issues and how to sort those out over time. I feel that with daily fantasy sports, shared liquidity on a global basis is a huge boon to the industry and allows Italian operators to then expand around the world outwards, not just necessarily international companies coming into Italy.
Would you like to reply to that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't take exception to that. Although let me just just say that that's kind of when you come from a company that has a huge leadership position in one or two markets and wants to expand internationally, it's a natural thing to want. Now, I agree with what you're saying about the customer experience. I also agree with what you're saying about the issues in the sense that, for example, the collusion and fraud issue, I think for DFS is not as dramatic or is nowhere even near as dramatic potentially as it is for poker. The issue here is that there's two issues for me in regards to Italy. One is the political and regulatory debate around shared liquidity starts from the bigger markets. So it's difficult to conceive, an exception that could be made for DFS, which hasn't even really gotten off the ground in Italy yet. But if it did, if the debate was on that, I'd be willing to certainly engage in it. So the question was more about the latest European plan, which was focused on poker as a kind of a precursor to other games. And there I see huge issues. The one final thing I would say is I think that the regulatory framework needs to be put on the same footing, because it's very difficult. You know, it creates an unbalance of competition. If you have a license in one country and that limits you to 50 million potential inhabitants, and you're pooled with somebody who has a license in another country, and that license permits that operator to go anywhere in the world. So there's issues like that which would need to be harmonized, in my view, for things to work. And finally, the debate becomes interesting when you get into the B2B mode, right? Because the networking, it's one thing if you're an operator and you're pooling liquidity just for your players, and it's a different story if you're trying to put together different operators into a network. That generates also different issues in the sense of if you're putting in a network an operator that runs by certain rules with a network with an operator that runs by different rules, it creates no end of complexity to deal with. So just to conclude, everything you said, I agree with. The issue is to get it to practically happen. There's a number of things that would need to be done, I think.
Thank you all. Unfortunately, we're out of time. But again, once again, thank you for your participation. I'm sure the panelists will be happy to answer any questions over the next 2 days.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank a big thank you to our sponsors, to DraftKings. I'd like to thank also Hampus for being a mentor for me, also on setting the agenda, and for all the guests. We'll see you next year. Should be exciting to see what's going to happen next year. Thank you very much.